What I want to know about your recent knighthood, congratulations, by the way.
Thank you.
Did you consider holding out for a peerage?
I should have had you on the line at the time. Have you ever thought about being in the agency business?
No, we've got an agent coming up after
Right.
us. No, I'm not interested in that. But congratulations. It seems like for a native Brit, not an Englishman, but a native Brit, that it must be nice to be given a knighthood.
It's very flattering. And it was nice, yeah. Even though it hasn't changed my son's behavior.
He's not calling you Sir Michael.
Neither of them are.
All right. So, Mike, you've been a venture you've had at least 2 careers. You were a journalist. You had an interim period where you were an entrepreneur. Then you became a venture capitalist quite a few years ago at Sequoia. You've been through technology cycles. You announced about 18 months ago that you were stepping back from the management of Sequoia because of an illness that you have that you're not suffering from apparently, but and that you didn't want to disclose the details of. I'd like to ask you, for starters, how you're spending your time exactly.
Well, I felt that you couldn't manage a business and take a bunch of time off. And like Brian and John were saying earlier, running any business, and our business operates in multiple places, is a taxing, grueling existence. And I'd take a couple of weeks of vacation, 3 weeks or so of vacation a year, but nothing more. And I felt I couldn't keep managing and running the business if I wanted to take a lot of time off for personal reasons. It was just inconsistent with running a high-performing business. And so I removed myself entirely from the management of Sequoia's business, but I'm very active on the investment side. So I participate as part of the investment team at Sequoia, and that allows me time to go and say yes to the invitations that for 20 years I've always said no to. And I told everybody I'd take about 12 weeks off a year. I have no interest in retiring. I want to be very active in the investment business, but I need time for myself. And so I take 12 weeks off dotted through the year, and it's working quite well.
And so when you are not on vacation, are you spending most of your time scouting and participating in investments?
Completely. Yeah, I was in the office this morning before coming here, for sure.
And lest I not ask you, you caused a bit of mystery with there's public release of the letter that you wrote to Sequoia's investors, and you said, I have this illness, I'm not going to share any details about it. Do you want to share any more details than you have?
No, I thought I disclosed enough, and the key thing was to be very straightforward with people and let them know what the issues were, and so that everybody understood what my commitment was, and I was going to live up to my commitment.
You recently said in an interview that the venture capital business has become more attractive recently, and I'm wondering what you mean by that.
I first started getting interested in the venture business around 1980-81, joined Sequoia a little bit later than that. And if you go back 30 years and think about where technology had gone in the economy, which sort of niches and crevices of the economy it had percolated through, it was far more limited than it is today. And so as technology has gone fracking around the whole US economy, people in the venture industry have just been able to follow it. So there are all these places that people like us didn't invest because technology didn't play a big part in it. And we only have to look around the room here to think about circa the 1980s and people in Silicon Valley investing in advertising companies and media companies and entertainment companies. Those were all considered beyond the pale. And today, obviously, it's an extremely important part of our business. Or think about the hospitality and the travel business, or the retailing business. Venture capitalists in Silicon Valley didn't participate in in any of those. So that's one thing, as technology has sluiced through more parts of the economy. And the second thing is that there are far more experienced people today, or far more people today, who've experienced life in a thriving, growing startup or fast-growing technology company than there were 20 or 30 years ago. So there's a far greater, really experienced pool of people.
I like this metaphor very much of the venture capital industry, equating it with fracking, able to go off in horizontal areas.
Well, we've never been very good at marketing. Nor is the oil industry. You would have thought the oil industry would have chosen a different word from one that began with F and ended in G.
Yeah, I'm not sure they chose fracking. It might have been chosen for them. It's interesting you mentioned venture capitalists getting involved in retailing. An investment generation ago, venture capitalists did get involved in retailing. You, for example, made an investment in a company called Webvan.
It's nice of you to remember that.
Well, we all enjoyed it a lot. Maybe you didn't enjoy it. But you clearly, I assume, you learned something from it because you've made a somewhat similar investment recently. And I say somewhat because I'm sure you'll want to explain why Instacart is not Webvan.
Instacart is a young company in San Francisco that Sequoia invested in a couple of months ago. And it's a crowdsourced model for home delivery of groceries. And it offers a way to escape the enormous capital infrastructure burden. That was one of the things that was so tricky and complicated about Webvan. When Webvan was a company that was, in computer parlance, I think, trying to design the underlying computer architecture, the operating system, and then a whole bunch of the applications on top of it. And at Instacart, where the early reception has been very good to the service, think of it in the sort of similar manner to the way that you might think about a company like Uber, where you have a lot of independent contractors who, in this case, instead of driving cars, will attend to your grocery shopping needs.
Can you talk a little bit about how this investment came to Sequoia?
Like a lot of the investments that have come our way, a friend of a friend talked to us about it and told us about it and encouraged the founder and the CEO to come and chat with us, and one thing led to another, and we've wound up as business partners of a wonderful founder named Apurva Mehta, who earlier in his life had worked for several years at Amazon.
Is it necessary that a startup company that you invest in potentially have high barriers to entry? Because this company doesn't sound like it has, like there are high barriers to competitors.
I think it's interestingly only part of the reverse mythology of Silicon Valley that many companies come to be perceived as having high barriers. And if you think back to the first week of many of the very well-known companies that always come up in conversations like this, whether it was John's eBay or Apple in the very early days, or Yahoo or Google in the first few weeks of their incarnation, there were no barriers to entry for any of these companies. And the companies that do tend to have big technology barriers to entry will be ones who have spent 18 months to 2.5 years in designing and developing a technology that they then subsequently introduce to the market and to their customers. And it's only then that they're going to discover whether or not their technology meets what the customers want. We've been involved with a whole slew of companies that have built their barriers as they've gone along. We invested in Cisco Systems in 1987, and everybody said, "Why are you guys investing in Cisco Systems? Don't you understand that DEC, IBM, 3Com, Banyan, and a slew of other companies are already out there, and they're going to destroy your little company with 12 people that has no barriers to entry.
Can you talk about when you're an investor in a young company and things aren't going well? You know, the popular expression in the Valley these days is pivot. The company needs to pivot because whatever it's doing isn't working, right?
Pivot. It's one of those marketing words like private equity.
But you've been involved in, I think of Flip.
Yeah.
Flip did a pivot, didn't it? And it turned into a very successful
Well, I wouldn't
pivot.
call it a pivot. I would call it a near-death experience. That's what a pivot is.
Yes.
It's a near-death experience. It's when you're down at hedgerow level and the branches are going through the bottom of the fuselage.
And how long do you wait? Do you see it coming?
It depends how long the prayer session is.
So can you give us some? I'm looking for your reflections as a board member, as an investor, as what you do, what you advise entrepreneurs to do when things aren't working.
I always think of it, and people are always very skeptical about this response, but I always think about it as if it's a very close family member who's involved running the business. It's somebody who has worked incredibly hard. Because starting a business, founding a company is the hardest act in business. And people who haven't done it don't really understand how taxing it is, how demanding it is, the emotional costs and consequences of it. And so I always think, gosh, if this was a cousin or a sister or a brother running this business, do I think it's worth them spending the next period of their life, 2 or 3 years of their life, trying to salvage something from what seems like an incredibly distressing situation? And if the answer is yes, then we're all in. And if it's no, I will tell them that. But invariably, and those sorts of conversations come around when you're thinking about whether or not to sell a company, whether the most prudent thing to do is to sell it or not sell it. And on the whole, we really, really dislike selling companies. And but there are some situations where you think, gosh, the way that this person really, the best thing for them is going to be to sell it and then move on to something fresh and new and more promising.
You say that you, Sequoia, you personally really don't like selling. The two examples of companies that come to my mind that you've sold, that have been sold, are Flip, I mentioned, and the founding CEO, Jonathan Kaplan, in fact, moved on. Mm-hmm. You're invested in his grilled cheese sandwich company, which I'm going to ask you about in a moment. And Zappos, and the founder, Tony Hsieh, didn't move on. But in both cases, my assumption is that you personally were instrumental in the sale.
Well, in both cases, I felt it was, or Sequoia felt anyway, it was the right thing to do to sell both companies. In the case of Flip and Pure Digital, it was the concerns and issues that we had around, the onslaught of video integrated into cell phones. But even so, I think there was still a pretty bright and robust future for long format, very easy to use video cameras. You only have to look at the incredible success of GoPro to see some of the, Flip was never going to be a company that was going to be put out of business by the iPhone or Android devices. But
apparently Cisco didn't get the memo on that.
Well, I think it's very hard to be both an enterprise and a consumer company, and they discovered that. And at the time that they purchased Flip, they wanted to be much more of a consumer company. And with Zappos, you've got to think back to the time where this was whenever it was, 2008 or so, where the company's financing could have disappeared in a whisker. Remember how grim the financial times were. And we had a $60 or $70 million credit line or working capital line from the Wells Fargo Bank. And one person could have changed their mind, and that line could have been withdrawn, and there were lots of financing facilities withdrawn for promising companies at that period. But clearly, when we originally became involved with Zappos, our desire was to be able to have a standalone, enduring company whose premise would be to clothe America from head to toe. That was the goal. That was what we wanted. I think that was what all of us connected with the company wanted. And it wasn't a case of celebration and elation when the company was sold to Amazon. For me, at least, it was disappointment.
I want to ask you a twofold question about payments. First of all, if you could share with us the names of some of the payment companies that you're currently invested in. And the second part of my question is this a direct result of your experience with PayPal or not necessarily?
Well, we were talking, and I'd broaden it beyond just payments and include financial services. And financial services is a very important part of our business. And people never think about that as being a meaningful segment for a partnership like Sequoia, but we've probably invested in the last 12 to 14 years in about a dozen financial services companies because of the changes in the underlying infrastructure and the opportunities presented with this distribution of technology. So yes, we invested years and years ago in PayPal, but we were investors in one of the very early financial services companies called dotcom. And these days it's companies like Green Dot, which is a publicly traded company providing affordable finance to lower income Americans, and has also pioneered a bank called GoBank, which is probably banking for the mobile, will come to be seen as banking for the mobile generation. And there are lending marketplaces like Prosper, and then there are a couple of other companies, one a young company in San Francisco called Stripe, that is making payments far easier for anybody thinking of wanting to do commerce on the web. And their real appeal is the simplicity and the ease with which they remove all the complexity of interfacing with complicated underlying payment infrastructure for young companies. And then in Sweden, we have a very sizable partnership with a company called Klarna that provides a deferred credit system, much like Bill Me Later did here in the United States, in Europe, and is enormously successful company.
And excuse me, why do you say sizable partnership as opposed to investment in it?
Because I think a lot of people, I blanch these days at being bracketed as an investor, because I think it's a catch-all term that anybody who has a checkbook can raise their hand and say, I'm an investor. And I think what we try to do with the relationships that we have with many of these companies, some of which extend for 10, sometimes 15 years, where we are co-owners of the company. We're not confused about who runs the company or who started the company, but we have a real long-term plan. And where we provide a lot of things that people who raise their hands and dub themselves investors just don't provide. And you'll get that if you talk to some of the people who are involved running some of these companies.
I might paraphrase what you're saying to say that you, in your opinion, you're better investors than some of your competitors. But what you just described has been the MO of Sequoia for as long as you've been around and longer. Is it a change in thinking on your part, semantics? You know what? We're more than investors.
Oh, I think it's just like everything else. You know, you react to changing. We've always changed with the times, and and so we're just reacting to, you know, the market as it exists today. But there is a very substantial difference if you have a partner who owns a meaningful percentage of your company, who's concerned about it, who's worrying about it, who's thinking about it, who has lots of resources that can be devoted to a particular company.
Mike, I'm going to hit you with a handful of quick topics before we go to questions. The first is I made a reference earlier that you're invested in a company called The Melt. A grilled cheese sandwich and tomato soup retailer. Does not sound to me like a typical Silicon Valley investment. Why are you invested in that company?
This is a company with a chain of restaurants for now in the Bay Area and Los Angeles that was started by an entrepreneur that you mentioned earlier, Jonathan Kaplan, who previously started Pure Digital, the maker of Flip, the video camera, which I should add was the best-selling video camera in the world, beating Sony and Panasonic and Casio and Samsung for several years.
And by units, I assume.
In units, but nonetheless a heroic feat on Jonathan's part. And he was very enthusiastic about, and he didn't know anything about the video camera business when he started that business or the camera business, and had been thinking about this particular business for a long time and came to us with it. But you're absolutely right. It's certainly an unusual investment for us.
So fair to say that it's largely or exclusively predicated on your trust and belief in the entrepreneur as opposed to any love for the business model?
No, we're not that, we're not quite as pure as the driven snow in that respect. No,
but you're not sentimental.
We think it's you know, the quick service restaurant business is a very, very large market, and we wouldn't want to be an investor in a chain of restaurants where we thought there'd only be 30 or 40 restaurants. There's an opportunity, if everything comes to pass, of building something substantial, but we'll see.
I've written, and now I'll say it in front of you, that you, in my opinion, wrote one of the finest books ever written on Apple many years ago now, and so I'd like to ask you if you think that Apple's best days are behind it, or if its best days are in front of it.
I think its best growth rates are behind it, and we'll figure out whether its best days ahead or good days are ahead of it when it introduces new products.
But what does your gut tell you? Will they introduce the kind of mind-blowing products that they've introduced over the last 15 years?
We will have to wait and see. I'm not going to offend people at Apple who are all working super hard to make sure that they don't disappoint themselves, and I'm certainly rooting for them. Sequoia was the original investor in the company.
People in this room probably don't know that you, in addition to your book on Apple, The Little Kingdom, you also wrote a book about Detroit. It was called Going for Broke, The Chrysler Story. I'd like to know if you're following what's going on in Detroit these days and what your opinion of it all is.
Avidly, with great interest. You know, and I lived in Detroit. I like living in Detroit. It's really distressing to see what's happened to that city, and I'm very interested in the underlying current that doesn't really come out that much in a lot of the coverage about the crippling costs of the public obligations that generations of politicians signed up for, which has helped precipitate the crisis in Detroit, and which did it in Jefferson County, Alabama, Vallejo, California, Stockton, California, and it's an endemic problem that will sweep across the nation. So I'm really, really interested in it, and I think it's one of the big social discussions and topics of the day, which is how you take care of public workers who have been promised pensions and health care benefits when the people who made the promises knew that they weren't going to be able to keep the promises, or more particularly, their successors would not be able to deliver the promises. and it's going to be one of the huge social debates of the next 10 years in the United States.
Of course, you dipped your toe in the water of this debate by backing a politician in San Francisco who was trying to engage on this issue. Do you see doing more nationally?
Well, we're funding some research into this to try and at Stanford to try and highlight, just in a very calm and sober manner, the extent of the issue.
I'm sorry, when you say we, you mean your wife and you?
Yeah, the issue facing people. But when you go up, it's a very, as everybody knows, it's a highly politicized, very emotional debate. But it's one that needs to be faced up. Otherwise, you will have what you have in Detroit, which is complete meltdown in public services and an hour to get anyone from a police department to show up.
My last question, first, another thing that probably most of you in the room don't know. According to the Sequoia website, Mike's first job in life was delivering chickens in Wales. Did you enjoy delivering chickens?
I remember getting told I had to deliver chickens up and down the Welsh valleys in the summer heat, and the job was in an unrefrigerated van.
So were these live chickens or dead chickens?
Dead chickens. And they were certainly dead in the heat. They'd all died of heat exhaustion by the time that they got to the restaurants. And I remember getting a very firm and stern lecture from the guy who ran the company saying that I was giving everybody, setting a terrible example, because I'd cut the delivery time in half from everybody else who had previously had the job.
What is your advice to a young person or not so young person who would like to become a venture capitalist the way you did? How should they go about doing it, and should they do it?
I think everybody should. Look, there have been a few other people who've been extremely fortunate and lucky like I have, and I think, you could have put a chimpanzee in Silicon Valley in 1986 and they would have been successful in the venture business. People just have to follow their instincts and try and do what they think is going to excite them every day. I think probably it's more fun, more rewarding, more demanding, more taxing to go and start a company.
As opposed to being an investor in one.
For sure.
Questions? Yes, right there. Please identify yourself.
Jonathan Krim with the Wall Street Journal. Given your involvement in the payment and financial services space, I'd love to hear you talk about Bitcoin.
It's obviously it's one of these topics that, when the Winklevoss twins get into business, it's serious.
Is that your full answer?
I think there are so many barriers to. I think the idea of a digital currency that is far easier to move around is very appealing and very attractive. There are a whole variety of reasons why I think it's going to be extremely difficult for Bitcoin to seep anywhere close to the mainstream. There are a whole raft of reasons. So great skepticism associated with that, but great allure associated with making payments easier and removing a lot of the barriers that still exist in the way that people transact with one another.
Sir Michael, thank you for sharing your time with us. Please join me in thanking Michael Moritz.